how are you going to respond to that? How are the U.S. industries that are relying on the reshoring we have done in Mexico and Central America going to be able to continue that if those markets, both incoming and outgoing markets, are no longer available to us?
Companies operating in today's global economy really need to get an understanding of the international geopolitical risk landscape. At Infortal Worldwide, we work with our clients on solving risk before it starts. Welcome to the Riskology podcast, where we're looking at managing business risk globally and really understanding the geopolitical risk landscape.
All right, welcome everyone to episode 25 of Riskology by Infortal, a milestone moment for the podcast. And couldn't think of anyone better to bring as our guest for this milestone event, and that's Tom Fox, head of the Compliance Podcast Network. So welcome back, Tom.
Chris, thanks. Really enjoy getting the chance to visit with you guys. Love what you guys have done with the pod. Can't wait to see where you take it, and ready to have some real fun today.
Yeah, I think so too. Again, it's wild. We've hit episode 25 and Ian's with us again today as well. And Ian, we've hit over 7 hours of content so far, believe it or not.
More than 7 hours of risk.
Yeah, right. So today we thought we would jump into sort of the current state of affairs in terms of the world of geopolitics and tie that back to the corporate world, compliance teams, and really kind of take a deep dive into why it's important for every compliance team that's out there today. And so right off the bat, we'll start with one of the big heavy-hitting topics that everyone has seen in the headlines, and that's conflict, right? We have two major wars happening around the world. We've got buildups by nations, across Europe, across Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, and everyone's kind of scrambling at the moment. And we thought it would be important to highlight the fact that this is important for businesses and companies to consider as well. So Tom, I don't know if you have any immediate thoughts about sort of how conflict is being viewed in corporate circles.
That's really the theme I want, at least my part of this podcast, to be about, which is what's the response? Perhaps the most prescient thing I heard coming out of the pandemic was we've moved from disaster recovery to business resiliency to business as usual. And if you are not ready to do business as usual, you are not going to be successful. And I can't remember the last time we visited or how many conflicts ago that was.
Right.
Just think about what we've seen in calendar year 2024. And I know we're going to go through some of these things and how we've had to respond to those. But I'm going to challenge all of us to think about what's the next step in those conflicts. So those conflicts are resolved. What opportunities are there going to be to reconstruct Gaza, to reconstruct Ukraine, to reopen shipping in the Straits of Hormuz, China, Russia, all of those places? And then how do we, from a corporate perspective, respond, but from a compliance perspective too? And I've just hit on the things I know that are going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
There's probably 10 more things that the three of us could guess or each are going to happen. And they may or may not happen, but you have to be ready, willing, and able to respond in a way with nimbleness, agility, and quickness that I don't think you had to do pre-pandemic. We've always had to respond, but now it's to events that 3 months from now, we may be looking at something none of us could have anticipated. Maybe some people had, but the point is you're going to have to respond, and you're not going to have a lot of time to think. You may have to respond quickly if your supply chain is shut down, if your distribution network or largest customer is no longer available to you for a trade sanction reason. So I really want the theme, at least for me, to be companies need to be ready, willing, and able to respond. We're going to talk about some of the tangible or temporal challenges that we see in either conflicts or business or other. Or I used to laugh about regime change. Well, now that's called an election. And what do the upcoming elections mean here and abroad? So we got a lot to talk about, and I can't wait to get into it.
Yeah, with that being said, let's take a deeper dive. I think that's a really great way to look at these issues, Tom, in terms of how companies are preparing today. It could be very different in the near term, and companies really need to be a lot more nimble today than in years past. And something that we've noticed through negotiations and changing relationships around the world is the status quo of the past couple of decades is no longer the case in terms of international relations. And the flow of business and commerce, likewise, is changing very rapidly. Ian, I know you've got some thoughts about that and the changing relationships.
Yeah, there's 2 things well, there's 3 actually that kind of highlight the tectonics of our current moment. The one is for sure that the world of the 1990s is dead. It is dead. If 9/11 didn't kill it, the pandemic, 2008, and what's going on now have totally just undone that. Globalization kind of undoes itself periodically, and this is one of those eras that we're in. But aside from that, you have a couple of things that are also taking place that no one really highlights. And everyone sort of looks at these conflicts that are going on, whether you're talking about Israel and Iran, Ukraine, or China, they're all tied together. This is the big battle for Eurasia. We're kind of sitting over here in the Western Hemisphere in the New World looking at it from a distance, but this is actually really massive. We've been here before. You had Xi Jinping and Putin meeting. You've had Iran and Russia meeting. And just a few decades ago, we had very similar things where Japan and Germany were talking about a very similar sort of attempt to take on Eurasia as a whole. And Italy was part of that. Italy was the weak player, but that's Iran today. And you have this massive landmass where China and Russia are looking at things like the Belt and Road Initiative. And you've had this thing called the IMEC, the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that was sort of proposed as an alternative to the BRI. That was going to include Saudi normalization with Israel. That was just like September last year that was announced. What happened October 7th? Hamas, which is the proxy of Iran, set into motion this massive sort of thing that's taking place in the Middle East now. And you can't divorce those things. But from an economic standpoint, what that's done by shutting down the shipping through the Red Sea, you're massively diminishing it, and the Arabian Sea and also the Indian Ocean, thanks to the Houthis, which are backed by Iran. You now have an economic trade system because of these conflicts in Ukraine and in the Middle East that have thrown us back 500 years, in a sense, in terms of the trade routes. You got to go all the way around Africa now to get to East Asia. I mean, that throws us back pre-Suez Canal, at least to when the Portuguese made it to India. So that's a massive setback that's artificially created because of conflict. In the past, that was just because of technological inability and logistics. But now it's actually because of conflict. So if you're a multinational or if you're an SME, how are you looking at these things at the strategic level of the CEO? And how are you putting in plans to stay resilient, maintain your market access to capital, your supply chains, your suppliers, your logistics, integrity, your insurance costs? How do you strategically handle that at the one level while also dealing with it at the compliance level so that you can anticipate some things like sanctions, terrorist attacks, security costs, vetting who you hire, whether it be KYC in the financial realm? How do you catch it on the back end as well? And I think that kind of puts us into an interesting place where companies need to address both of these ends.
Yeah, definitely two sides to the story is the way that I'm hearing it, Ian. And circling back to what you mentioned before, Tom, there's opportunity and there's challenges, right? Immediately, there's tons of regulations coming into play that are fueling the trade wars that are going on. I think it was just the other day that Biden released a whole new set of tariffs on EVs coming out of China, critical minerals, and some other goods that we're heavily dependent on. So right off the bat, there's going to be some compliance, some tax issues to deal with. But the flip side of that is, based in the West, and especially here in America, we need to figure out how this is going to look going forward. And there's a lot of opportunities there because one, we need to ramp up production in certain areas and certain industries here in the US. But even geographically, if you look at the North America, South America relationships, there's a lot of opportunities there to create new flow of trade and new manufacturing. We're seeing a lot of sort of warehousing and supply chain moving to Mexico, but really we need to start ramping up some manufacturing and sourcing of resources. What are your thoughts there, Tom, on sort of the reshoring dynamic?
The reshore dynamic is incredibly interesting. It's an incredibly fascinating discussion on multiple levels. But if we have regime change in the United States, you can only anticipate U.S.-Mexico relationships will go to a nadir. And will that obliterate all of the commercial treaties, NAFTA or its successors? Will we have that ability to continue trade with the ticky tax that will start up? Will we have cooperation on any of the law enforcement around drug importation into the United States? I anticipate that entire relationship to spiral downward. And if we lose Mexico, Mexico's, if not our largest one, our top three trading partners. What happens if we lose them? What happens if we have reshored in northern Mexico for manufacturing purposes? Will that no longer be available to us? What happens if we reshore further south into Central America or South America? What about the trade routes? Will Mexico try to interdict those? And then if we flip over to Europe, the first thing Donald Trump would do is cut off all arms to Ukraine, and Ukraine would either be taken over by the Russia. Sorry, I'm of that age. Or they will have to become a puppet state of Russia, or certainly in the Russian orbit. The next step would be to attack Western Europe, former Baltic states of the Soviet Union. I'm sure Trump was looking for any excuse to abrogate NATO treaty. And if we don't respond to our treaty signatories under NATO, that will end that relationship. And then I'm sure he will put trade sanctions on Europe because he's bought and paid for by Russia. So will we lose Europe as another primary trading partner? Now, that means, of course, Russia would open up to us as a trading partner because all sanctions would be lifted against Russia under a Trump administration. So what does all of that mean for business? That you're going to have to pivot. All of that speculation is certainly open speculation, but how are you going to respond to that? How are the U.S. industries that are relying on the reshoring we have done in Mexico and Central America going to be able to continue that if those markets, both incoming and outgoing markets, are no longer available to us?
Yeah, you definitely hit the magic word for today, and that's election. Over half of the world is heading to the polls this year. So everyone's looking at the election here in the US, no matter where you sit around the globe. But many of our trading partners are also having significant elections and more unpredictable elections than in years past. And I think the way that you describe the relationship with Europe, we're already seeing some of that come true because if you look at how NATO and the NATO countries have been acting lately, they're almost looking at the situation as though they can't depend on the US like they could in the past in terms of funding, in terms of resources, but also strategically managing troops on the ground. We've played a huge role during the peacetime era. And if you think about it tactically, they've got to have a whole new approach in terms of potentially jumping into a hot situation. So again, I think the elections will be definitely another area to watch. Ian, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think there's two things that are going on from like a hemispheric standpoint. I mean, the one thing that we're seeing also in just Latin America, but also in the US, is that other countries and companies around the world are also looking at Latin America to sort of safeguard supply chains. And that hasn't happened for a while. You did see this during World War II. You had the Arab good feelings, for example, between the US and Latin America. And I think you're going to see more of that, where you have companies and investors from the other hemisphere looking for a safe haven and supply chain access and things like that. And Latin America is going to be, as well as the US, just in terms of reshoring domestically, those are going to be attractive prospects. So from an economic standpoint, there is a silver lining to this from a hemispheric vantage point. And then, I mean, going back to NATO, there's two things too to keep in mind is that Ukraine's not the only game in town. There's also China and whether or not the US could viably support Europe and also support Taiwan and Japan. And I think the short answer to that is no. So I think leadership aside, you're seeing countries that are US allies looking at revamping their own military capacities. And I think what we're seeing is that the alliances and partners that the US has developed since World War II, they can actually punch back pretty well. Keep in mind that everyone thought that Ukraine was going to be rolled over in a week, and that didn't turn out to be true. You know, Iran's barrage on Israel turned out to be a giant nothing. I think even the Israelis were surprised about that. And I think that, as well as, you know, you're looking at Japan sort of rearming and working with South Korea, whoever would have thought that would have happened. For example, Australia is looking at building up. I think they see that sort of necessity to be able to carry their own weight to a degree, not that the US wouldn't be a partner, but that taking more of an active role in their own defense, I think you're seeing that. And that's going to be the case across the globe. But I think those countries that I think from the US vantage point that we thought, well, they needed all this assistance. I think everyone's kind of surprised, including China, that a lot of these countries can pack a punch and take care of themselves to a large degree. Not that those relationships would ever be severed, but they're proving to be more resilient than a lot of people thought.
Yeah, it's a great point. Again, going back to the theme of how unpredictable things are at the moment, both for adversaries of the US and for our allies, it's not a given which way a conflict's going to go, to say the least. And same with the elections, it's hard to predict. And so, what does that mean for companies? And we do like to highlight potential solutions throughout our conversations. It means you really need to prepare and sort of game out the different scenarios. And you can only do that if you get a true understanding holistically of what your risk exposures look like. So, you really need to do a deep dive on your current operations, know where you sit today, and start conducting the right levels of due diligence to understand what are the factors you need to be concerned about on the horizon. Once you do that, you can start building out your risk mitigation plans, your monitoring, threat monitoring plans if needed. And then you can go forward in a much more sort of forward footing than some of your competitors. And I think that circles back to what you may have mentioned before, Tom, about having more of a nimble approach.
The model I would point to, or at least the example, is conflict minerals under Dodd-Frank. And companies who are subject to that bemoan the fact that they had to go 5 or 6 levels down their supply chain to try and determine they were not engaging in or using in any way, shape, or form conflict minerals. Well, the people who did that, the companies that did that, found it was one of the best exercises they had ever gone through from the business perspective because they found redundant suppliers, they found inefficiencies in their supply chain system, they found potential risks, they found potential weaknesses. And that model, I think, can be used literally by every company. It is work. I don't pretend to say it's not. But if you take that model, as you have suggested, Chris, as a risk mitigation strategy or as a risk mitigation exercise, when those things now come up, I think as a company, you'll be in a much better position from a business perspective to be able to respond. So whether that was compliance driven because of Dodd-Frank or business driven, the model's in place and companies can use that model to map out their risks so that they can respond from a business perspective. So I would hope businesses who doing business internationally, whether from the supply chain on an inbound basis or if their customer base is outside the United States, what are you going to do if we lose China as a customer and they're your largest customer? I mean, what's Apple going to do? I'm sure they're gaming this out as thoroughly as anyone, or at least I would hope so. But the strategies, the tools, and tactics are in place today for companies to do that.
That's exactly right. The tools are there. It's really just looking at a new set of risks and a new way of operating. But the tools, in large part, are there to use. They just need to be used in a different way and sort of pointed at these risks that we've been describing. And like you said, some of the bigger players really have found some efficiencies in doing the work up front. And hopefully, as you mentioned, we'll continue to see that. I know there's a lot of regulations coming out in Europe in the near term. And so that may be a good test case to see where there's even more solutions available. But again, there are processes and tools in place. It's just a case of taking that first step. And really, once you do that, you're in a much stronger position to make decisions going forward. Ian, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on the due diligence front.
Yeah, I mean, I think European companies offer kind of a decent test case with this because, we've talked to European potential clients and others who they seem to understand these things better than American companies do. BMW, for example, they did this thing to basically go from literally rock to smelter in their supply chains to examine for everything from ESG to corruption to human trafficking and child labor. And they basically tracked their own products going all the way from raw materials to the actual manufacturing floor. That's a model that other companies can emulate as they work to sort of integrate these things. And of course, they need boots on the ground assistance. Companies like ours can do that, of course, but it's a model that other companies in the US can look at. Like if you're Apple right now and you're worried about potentially losing China, you better be figuring out all the partners and steps along the way to make the iPhone the next big thing in Brazil and India that can make up that market loss. And hopefully companies that are relying on China as a customer base, hopefully they're looking at places like India and Brazil and maybe Nigeria, other places to sort of make up that lost market share.
Yeah. And you mentioned something as well I wanted to highlight. Boots on the ground approach is so important. I think it's the OECD OECD has really highlighted the fact that in some of these areas that we've been talking about, there's no way you'll be able to assess the risk unless you get an on the ground look at what's going on. So, particularly in the rare earth mineral space, supply chain as well, you've got to get a firsthand view. You don't have to do it every day, all day long, but at least in the beginning, as you're mapping out your plan, you need to have some eyes on what's going on and then periodically sort of follow up. Well, we're coming close to the end of the episode 25. Still can't believe it. We're about halfway through the year, so it'll be interesting to see how this all takes shape as we head through 2024. Tom, we've really enjoyed having you again. Maybe we'll have you towards the end of the year or end of Q3 to sort of see where the world is sitting at that point.
Anytime, gents, I'd love to do so.
All right. Thanks again. It's Riskology by Infortal.